Hi, this is Michael Leahy here of the Irish Freedom Party. In the old days of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence, there was a term which was used to describe those states. They're described as one-party states. It was possible, theoretically, for a variety of parties to run for election, but they did have to have one thing in common, and that is that they had to support the policies and aims of the Communist Party. It's questionable whether Ireland is moving in that direction. In our political system, every single party in the Dáil has exactly the same opinions on all of the issues that matter most to the Irish people. I'll give you some examples of that. First of all, a slavish adherence to the European Union and its ruinous policies in regard to the war, in regard to environment, and in regard to public policy. They all support restrictions on free speech and freedom of political association. All of our parties have committed to support the upcoming referendum to restrict your rights to own property and even to own your own home. They all seem to believe, by the way, that the only way to solve the current housing crisis, which they have created, is to rely excessively on public ownership of housing, which will have the effect of preventing ordinary working families from acquiring their own house. Our parties fall over one another in their enthusiasm for open-door, unvetted immigration system, and they condemn ordinary Irish people who oppose this as being far right. They're not far right. They're people who care for their country and oppose the utterly destructive system being implemented by the government, which will lead to social unrest and the destruction of the historic Irish nation. In regard to climate change, all of our policies, no sooner does one party ramp up the proposed restrictions, then the next party will try to outdo them in thinking of ways to inflict economic hardship and suffering, not just on you, but on your children, and not just on you for the rest of your life, but on future generations. And remember, these policies will do absolutely nothing to have any effect whatsoever on the climate. The matters that I've listed there are by far the most important issues that face us. And I think it is fair to say that there's not a proverbial cigarette paper of difference between, say, Fine Gael on the one hand and Sinn Féin on the other hand in regard to any of these matters. They are also agreed in making it impossible for any other party to put forward alternative viewpoints. And this is where the hate speech legislation presently before the Dáil comes in. The sole purpose of this legislation is not anything to do with prevention of hate or dissension. It is to close down debate and to criminalise those who seek to put forward an alternative political narrative. It will, of course, be done initially in the area of immigration, and both our Minister for Justice and our Garda Commissioner are already looking at ways of fighting what they call disinformation. In other words, they're looking at ways of finding ways to stop people from telling the truth. In any situation of universal political uniformity, the only thing that can save our society and our democracy is a free and independent legal system protected by an independent police force and judiciary. Another name that was often given to the old Eastern Bloc countries is that they were police states. And this referred to a situation where the police force was used not to administer justice in an open or even-handed fashion, but to use as a strong arm of a coercive and authoritarian government system. I'm afraid when one watches the recent performance of the Minister for Justice, the Acting Minister for Justice, and the Commissioner of Garda Síochána, fulminating against what they absurdly describe as far-right manipulation of the popular protests that are now emerging against uncontrolled immigration, then I'm afraid we must ask serious questions about the future survival of our state. These are not manipulated protests. These are popular protests that ordinary people are arranging because they're becoming very, very concerned about what's happening. I can assure you they're not orchestrated by our party. Our party has attended some of them, and we've been very welcome when we have done so. But we're certainly not orchestrating or manipulating anybody. Mr. Drew Harris, as Garda Commissioner, bids fair to become the most politicised head of the Irish police force since the 1920s. He recently stated that he believes that the popular protests that I spoke of in places like East Wall and Ballymun have been orchestrated by sinister forces controlled by agencies outside of the state. He has used the all-encompassing term of far right to describe ordinary Irish people concerned at the government's actions. These are not the type of statements that we should expect from somebody who wishes to implement the law in an even-handed fashion. Is he equally concerned, for example, about the mobs of leftist fanatics who try to break up peaceful demonstrations organised by legitimate political parties, break up those demonstrations and rallies using intimidations and threats? I assume he is including the Irish Freedom Party in what he terms as far-right parties. And if he has any evidence that we are engaged in some dastardly plot with sinister foreign forces, then he should bring forward his evidence, rather than making what I can only describe as foolish and inflammatory statements to the newspapers. If he seriously thinks there is a foreign orchestrated threat by the operation of legitimate political parties in this country, and if he is prepared to make statements to that effect without evidence, that I can only suggest he may not be a fit person for the great office that he holds. An Garda Síochána rightly hold the respect and affection of the great majority of Irish people. My own father wore that uniform for 44 years, and all of our family are very proud of that fact. However, it only takes one unsuitable officer to destroy the good name of an entire organisation. Mr. Harris can, if he continues in the route he is going, destroy the trust which it has taken generations to build up between the people and the Garda Síochána. You can often tell a great deal about somebody by their voice. In my experience, when somebody adopts an innocent affectation to their voice, it's time to watch out. We would not expect better from Mr. Simon Harris, the Acting Minister for Justice. As Minister for Health during the COVID crisis, he showed his indifference to the constitutional protection for the liberties of the Irish people and the rule of law, and he effectively orchestrated the greatest attack against our liberties which we have witnessed since our Constitution was enacted in 1937. However, if the police force goes the same way as an unscrupulous and fanatical left-wing governments which we have, then our state is facing very dark times indeed. As always, these sensationalist statements coming from the centre of government, and in this case supported by the Gardaí, are intended to have a purpose. That purpose is likely to be the banning or, at some level, the proscription of those parties which oppose the government's policies, particularly in the area of immigration. Similarly, the housing crisis has been created and exacerbated by government in order to justify changes to the Constitution which will put an end to private property rights. Remember, all parties in the Dáil have committed to the 39th Amendment to the Constitution, which will effectively end the ownership of private property in this country. If you think I'm exaggerating about a proposal to prescribe the activities of legitimate political parties, then consider there are already proposals before the Oireachtas to prohibit demonstrations in certain areas in regard to immigration. This is why the bogeyman of the far right is being used to describe the opinions of the great majority of Irish people and those parties such as the Irish Freedom Party, which simply promote policies that every party would have subscribed to a mere 10 years ago. This has been Michael Leahy of the Irish Freedom Party urging you to get out onto the streets while you still can protest against the policies being enacted by this government, particularly in the field of immigration. We need to support the residents of East Wall, Ballymun, the other areas of all over the country which are being attacked by government policy. If we do not stop them now, we are heading for a totalitarian police state, and much sooner than we think. Thank you for your attention.